Hi, everyone. Thank you for joining. We're going to get started shortly. All right, we're going to go ahead and get started. Thank you, everyone, for joining today's webinar, Understanding the Journey to Policy Management Maturity. My name is Amanda Brief. I'm the Marketing Director here at ClauseMatch, and I'm going to be your moderator for today. Before we get started, I just have a couple of housekeeping items. Please note all the attendees are muted. If you have any questions, put them in the Q&A box, and they will be addressed at the end of the webinar. And with that, I'm going to hand it off to Michael.
It is a pleasure to be here today, and I look forward to spending this virtual hour with everybody, discussing understanding your journey in policy management maturity, how to move from the ad hoc to the agile. And you might not understand those levels yet, but you will as we get into this presentation today. But a lot of organizations are rethinking how they're approaching policy management right now, as well as their strategy, their process, and their information technology architecture to deliver on policy management maturity. Let's start with understanding navigating chaos. In this next slide, the modern organization is distributed, dynamic, and disrupted. Think about it. The modern organization is constantly changing. There's changing laws and regulations. Global financial services firms, as just one industry example, are dealing with 257 regulatory change events every business day, coming from 1,217 regulators around the world. That's a number from figure from Thomson Reuters. 257 regulatory change events every business day. That could be a new law or regulation, a change law or regulation, a notice of proposed rulemaking, or many other things. That enforcement actions, for example. And we have to keep policies current with regulatory change. I was working on a business case, helping a global bank with their business case for enterprise policy management several months back. And they had one policy because of regulatory change that took 6 months to get updated and went through 75 different reviewers in a linear fashion. And that's certainly not agile. That's a very slow policy management process in the midst of a lot of change. But it's not just regulatory change that we have to keep policies current with. It's also risk change as we have a shifting technology environment. It was 15 years ago, we were dealing with social media policies. 10 years ago, bring your own device policies. The last several years, it's been Internet of Things policies. Now it's the artificial intelligence policies. We have to keep policies current with technology change, risk change, like in the geopolitical risk and economic environments, shifts in industry practices and expectations. But we also have to keep policies current as the business changes. As the employees come into the organization, as they move to different departments and roles, as they exit the organization, they need to be reminded of policies of confidentiality and things. But we also have to keep policies current during mergers and acquisitions and across the extended enterprise of third-party relationships. Policy management in today's modern organization is navigating chaos. We have to keep policies current in a very dynamic, distributed, and disrupted business environment. And that's the challenge we face. How do we go about doing this? Well, let's first look at a case in point with COVID-19. On the next slide, where businesses changed and policies as well. Think about it. As we entered COVID-19 20 months ago in lockdowns, we had to address a lot of policies. We had to address the work from home policies, including home office expense policies and home office IT security policies. But as we, at the same time, we were responding to a pandemic and a disaster. There was a lot of cultural risk in the organization. And employees, some were being laid off, some were remaining. Those that were remaining, they had more responsibilities than they did before, so they had to be aware of more policies. But as people move these, organizations move these employees to work from home in a very, concerning environment, they often found that they had a lot of different policy portals. I was talking to one insurance company back in March of 2020, as we entered the pandemic, and they found out that they had over 20 different policy portals in the organization. And policies look different on different portals and had different templates and formats. And there's redundancies. And some of these portals had out-of-date policies or unauthorized policies. And in an environment where we're trying to maintain a strong corporate culture in the midst of chaos and a pandemic and restructuring of the organization, your policy management was working against the organization. And so they said, in order to really support a work from home environment, we need to have a singular policy portal where employees can log in and find any policy related to their job, role, and function. And it was easy to navigate, that there's a consistent approach to policies in the midst of moving people to the work from home environment in the lockdowns of COVID-19. But in that context, coming out of COVID-19, I'm seeing the same thing, even more so, that we have to support a hybrid work environment, and having multiple policy portals and multiple departments issuing policies in different ways, it does not work for the organization. That we need a singular policy portal and policy management process that can be implemented consistently across different departments and functions. But coming out of the pandemic, I'm seeing a lot of focus on how do we address rogue policies, those unauthorized policies, like back to work policies and the hybrid policies, hybrid work environment policies. You know, the organization might have done all of its strategic thinking on what policies we need for personal protective equipment and vaccination policies and back to work policies. But you get some manager at some level that says, I think a little bit differently than the rest of the organization. Maybe I think the virus is a hoax and I don't want my employees to wear masks or whatever it might be, or I'm not gonna require vaccinations when the organization has. Or the flip side, where maybe the employee, the manager out there thinks that the organization's not strict enough. And they're writing policies and calling them policies and communicating them to employees and customers. That puts a legal duty of care and exposure on the organization, opens up the doors of legal liability. And the organization needs to do something about that. I'm seeing a lot of organizations address policy management right now because of the number of rogue policies in the organization that put that legal duty of care and liability and exposure on the organization. That there should be one single source of truth for policies. And if it's official policy of the organization, it will be found in this portal. It'll be in this template and look like this, and it'll be indexed and numbered. And if you find anybody calling something a policy that is not, report it. We're seeing a big crackdown coming out of COVID-19 because of rogue policies. But just think about the number of policies that COVID-19 has revealed to us that need to be closely managed. You know, because of it's an interconnected risk environment. What starts off with a health and safety risk, and we had health and safety related policies, cascades into a lot of other policies, such as IT security policies. How do we secure the work from home environment? Look around me. My speaker in front of me is connected to the internet. My wall outlets are connected. My TV's connected. My exercise bike's connected. My blender in my kitchen downstairs is connected to the internet. I can program it with my iPhone. I have no idea why I would program with my iPhone, but I can. If any of these devices had a Trojan horse or backdoor, that could compromise my home office network and my connection to companies and the data on my laptop. You know, that's significant. And we had to address IT security, home office IT security policies, home office expense policies. We had to remind people about fraud and corruption policies. With the economic climate in concern 20 months ago, there's greater risk that employees might commit fraud. Good employees normally do good things under, the right circumstances, might choose the wrong thing. On top of that, you had increased risk of bribery and corruption, which had made people have to be reminded about facilitated payment policies, political contribution policies, gifts, entertainment, hospitality policies, and so forth. With the restrictions on customs and import and export, limited government contracts and permits, we've seen increased risk of violations of U.S. Foreign Corrupt Practices Act, UK Bribery Act, CEP and DU in France, and others because of the lockdowns. We've seen increased risk of modern slavery issues as factories have gone dark because of illness, and they've reopened with child labor and forced labor. And dealing with things like the UK Modern Slavery Act and other things, we have to remind not only our internal operations, but our third party and extended enterprise about our supply chain code of conduct and our focus on eradicating modern slavery. I can go on, but there's a whole host of policies that the organization has had to address because of the pandemic. It's just not a health and safety, it's an interconnected policy environment. Next slide, please. But change is the biggest challenge impacting policies. Dealing with the volume of legal and regulatory change. As I mentioned, global financial services firms are dealing with 257 regulatory change events every business day. That's a lot. And we have to keep policies current with all this legal and regulatory change. We have to keep policies current with risk change in market forces, geopolitical risks, competitive forces, shifts in technology. We also have to keep policies current with the changing business environment. That is really where a lot of the challenge is. I've seen stats that as much as 10% of the workforce in financial services are compliance professionals. We can be completely knowledgeable about the law and regulation, and we can answer every question posed to us about the law and regulation as a compliance professional, but does that make us compliant? Not at all. If that employee that just came into the financial services organization was not aware of the policy, or they moved from one department and role function to another, they're not compliant. If that technology and that process changed and it no longer follows the policy, we're not compliant. We have to keep policies consistent, not just with regulatory change, but also in the midst of business change in the environment and technology change and third-party relationships and shifting processes, but also mergers and acquisitions. I was talking to one large financial services firm that in the financial downturn of 2008 and all the consolidation in the industry found they had over 300 credit risk policies as they've acquired so many smaller firms. I was talking to a healthcare firm in California that that acquired nearly 30 hospitals over 20 years and found out they had 18,000 policies and procedures because each hospital came in with a completely redundant sets of policies and procedures. When I was presenting this in my policy management by design workshop 2 years ago in New York, I had a healthcare firm from New York said we can beat that because of all the mergers and acquisitions. We now have 21,000 policies and procedures, and we're trying to bring that down to 5. That's the challenge that we're dealing with, is trying to keep policies current in the midst of legal and regulatory change, risk change, and a changing business environment itself. And that is not easy. Next slide, please. Yeah, because a lot of times it's the Wild West of policy management. Let's use the Winchester Mystery House in San Jose, California as an example. The Winchester Mystery House was built in the 1800s, and it cost $5.5 million to build in the 1800s. You calculate for inflation, that is one very expensive house today. It took 38 years to build, had 147 different builders, but it had no design, no blueprint, no architect. It has doors that open to walls, doors that open to 20-foot drops, staircases that go up or down to nowhere, skylights that are in floors instead of ceilings. I just described many of your policy management program. That over the last 38 years, you had 147 different builders of policies in the organization, writing policies in their own templates and formats, and they have all their different portals. So all of a sudden you got 20 to 30 policy portals in the organization, just like that insurance company I referenced, and it's chaos. It doesn't make sense. The Winchester Mystery House is 10,000 windows. Instead, you have 10,000 policy documents, and it doesn't make sense. There's no logic or structure to it. Policy management has been a shoot from the hip, and we've got a lot of different departments go in different directions, and they're written in different language formats and issues. I was actually reviewing one Fortune 100 company's supply chain code of conduct. And this is about a decade ago. And I was shocked. This is a Fortune 100 company. And the supply chain code of conduct that goes out to an international audience with 20,000 facilities in their global supply chain was written in the passive voice and not the active voice. And it was only published in English. So right out of the gate, just how we're writing the policy doesn't make sense. We're not writing it in a way that's easy to understand because we're using the passive voice and not the active voice. Not only that, we had the challenge in this supply chain code of conduct that the first paragraph says company believes, the second paragraph says company strongly believes. So we have different levels of belief in the supply chain code of conduct? I don't think so, but that's exactly what it was communicating. And that's the challenge that we have before us, because anybody that has, even a native English speaker, but particularly somebody that has English as a second language, is going to say this second paragraph is more important than the first paragraph. And they're certainly not trying to communicate that. That's the Wild West of policy management. The Winchester Mystery House that doesn't make sense because there's been no design, no blueprint, no architect of what policy management should look like in the organization. Instead, on the next slide, we're battling the hydra of ineffective policy engagement. We have too many people sending too many messages in too many different ways. Look at the little talk bubble there. There are too many people from too many departments sending me too many different messages about too many policies. I can't make sense of it all or keep myself organized. You're that employee that back in March of 2020 went into lockdown, and all of a sudden there's all these shifts and changes, and they find out that the organization has 20 different policy portals, and policies look different, and there's conflicting policies, there's old versions of policies. It doesn't make sense. We have to address this. We have to do something about it. So let's look on the next slide, the drivers in policy management. We have the challenge of policies managed in documents and file shares or SharePoint sites that are scattered across the organization with no consistency in policy management strategy, process, writing, and delivery. We have reactive and inefficient policy training and awareness programs. Policies that do not adhere to consistent styles, like the policy on writing policies, what we call a meta policy, as well as style guides. And how do you write policies? How do you deal with gender neutrality now and personal pronouns in policies? How do we deal with writing in the active voice and not the passive voice? We need guidance and consistent style guides for policies. We have the issue of rogue policies, where any manager within a retail store or a branch manager at a bank can open up a word processor and write a document and call it a policy and put the organization under legal liability and exposure. We got out-of-date policies, policies that haven't been revised. There's no life cycle management. They don't map to exceptions and incidents. There's no exception management on policies. Guess what? If you've got exceptions to your policies, like your hospitality policies, gift and entertainment policies, and that regulator, law enforcement, external auditor, and they come like knocking on your door, opposing counsel in a lawsuit, and they're finding all these exceptions that aren't documented, they're going to look a lot deeper because they're going to find a lot more problems with your program, your compliance program, and controls in your environment. But if you can show them, oh yeah, we're fully aware of that exception. Here's when that exception was granted, who granted it, the reasons why it was granted, then you're going to get past scrutiny a lot easier. But so far we have policies managed as documents, and there's no like really good tagging of exceptions to them. We got policies that fail to cross-reference standards, rules, and regulations and lack any type of audit trail or defensible program. But on the next slide, we also should consider that policies are part of a strong corporate culture. Policies influence attitude, behavior, and culture. I'm a lifetime global honorary lifetime member and global ambassador of the Institute of Risk Management in London. And in the IRM, the Institute of Risk Management in London, built this great document called Risk Culture, Resources for Practitioners, talking about the relationship of attitude, behavior, and culture. And policies are essential for this because policies shape attitude, behavior, and culture. The culture of the organization influences both the behavior and the attitudes. The attitudes influence the behavior, and the behavior forms the culture. And all of this is a symbiotic relationship. Policies are absolutely critical if we want to guide the corporate culture and influence attitude and behavior. Corporate culture can be destroyed overnight with a bad incident. You can completely take a good, strong corporate culture and throw it into the tank and have a corrupt, awful culture as a result overnight. But it takes years to shape and build and improve culture. You can't change culture for the positive overnight, but you can destroy it overnight. And policies are critical in shaping and guiding that. But having the right policies and that are enforced is absolutely critical. I've got a code of conduct on my laptop here. Back in the year 2000, it was known to be the model code of conduct. Other companies were copying it to be their code of conduct. In fact, at my policy management by design workshop in Minneapolis, Minnesota a few years back, I had a petroleum company from Canada that told me we nearly copied that code of conduct word for word to be our code of conduct back in 2000. I'm talking about Enron's code of conduct. Enron, the one that led to Sarbanes-Oxley, that one. You know, having a great written document isn't enough. That document needs to be enforced. So when I talk about policies are essential for culture and shaping attitude, behavior, and culture of the organization, it's not just well-crafted, beautifully written policies. That's important, but it's enforced policies, policies that are expected to be lived by. So next slide. Today's organization needs to be able to see the tree as well as the forest. The individual policy as well as the interconnectedness of policies in the organization. And to show these policies relationships and how these policies map to risks, objectives, and so many other themes. We need to see the tree as well as the forest. Next slide, please. That forest means that we have to understand policies in context. Policies are governance documents. They help us reliably achieve objectives. And we look at the definition of governance, risk, and compliance, GRC. GRC is a capability to reliably achieve objectives. That's the governance function. Address uncertainty. That's risk management. In fact, ISO 31000 says risk is the effect of uncertainty on objectives. And act with integrity. That's the compliance piece. And I'm here to tell you that policies start with being governance documents. In fact, I've interacted with Starbucks as well as Suncor Energies in Canada. Both those organizations call their policy management program their governance documents program. Why? Because they help them reliably achieve objectives. Can you imagine an organization that didn't have policies? Our processes, our behaviors, our transactions would be like leaves blowing in the wind. They can go in any direction. Policies help us to reliably achieve the objectives of the organization. They're governance documents. They help us to make sure that our accounting processes like accounts payable and accounts receivable are consistently managed, and we have expected transactions and behavior, our procurement processes, our conduct, and everything else. But policies are also risk documents. The very fact that you have a policy means somebody's identified a risk. And that risk was significant enough that somebody had to sit behind a word processor, write a document, and call it a policy to address that risk. There would not be a policy if there was not a risk. But very few organizations have mapped their policies to their risks. I would even go further. Very few organizations even know what policies they have in their environment. I was talking to one firm that basically didn't understand how many policies they had in their environment. They went to my policy management workshop by design work in New York City, and they came out of it and said, we need to do a inventory of our policies because we don't even know what policies we had. And this is a global bank. And then over the summer, they found out they had 5,000 policies in North America. Then they pretty much doubled that when they looked at Europe and Asia. They just had to start with a policy inventory process. I was doing a keynote at a conference a couple of years back, and I asked everybody in the room, how many people, if the opposing counsel in a lawsuit, the regulator, law enforcement, whoever, the external auditor, they wanted to see a master index of all your policies in the entire organization, that you can produce that. 200 people in the room, 2 people raised their hand. Only 2 people had an index of all their policies across HR and IT and accounting and all these different areas. That's a mess. But every policy is a risk document. Not only do we need an inventory of policies, we need to understand how those policies map back to risk. And when we reassess that risk, we can look at the policy that addresses that risk. Then, of course, policies are compliance documents. They help us maintain the integrity of the organization. Next slide, please. So let's look at principles of policy management. I'm speaking today on my role as the analyst, and my job is research, understanding the challenges organizations face in context of governance, risk, and compliance, and how they go about solving that with strategy, process, and technology. But I've got another role in my partnership with OSEG, the Open Compliance and Ethics Group, where we have developed PolicyManagementPro.com. This is a training for policy management professionals. We built the policy management capability model on what are best practices for policy management out there. And we actually have training and a certification program, the Certified Policy Management Professional, that's available at PolicyManagementPro.com. But I wanted to go through a couple of themes on PolicyManagementPro.com. First, we have the 10 universal principles of policy management. First off, policies are necessary. Why? Because they're governance documents, they're risk documents, and they're compliance documents, just what I stated. Policies help the organization reliably achieve objectives as a governance document, manage uncertainty as a risk document, and act with integrity as a compliance document. Policies are necessary. Policies are also tailored. They're not a one-size-fits-all. The policy has to be right for your culture and tone of the organization. Can we go back to slide, please? And so we need to be able to make sure the policies address the needs of the organization. Policies are integrated. They need to be part of business processes, job roles, and functions. They're people-centered. They need to be part of the people of the organization, because at the end of the day, people read policies. And so we need to be able to write them in the right tone, in the right language, in the right writing style to communicate them effectively to the people of the organization. They need to enable a high-performing organization. They need to be standardized so that there's a common template, and you can understand that that's an official policy of the organization just by the way it's laid out, and you can recognize it, and it's properly indexed. They need to be collaborative. This is an important one. Today's policy management cannot be managed in a linear fashion where it goes through 75 different reviewers and approvers and it takes 6 months to get done. The business is too dynamic. It's changing too quickly. We need collaborative policy management where I could be writing that policy here in Milwaukee, Wisconsin. Maybe it's the conduct policy, and somebody could be reading my changes on screen as I make them in Singapore, and they could be adding their comments and their edits to the same thing, a collaborative policy process. Instead of this, open up a word processor, write a document, email to the next person, 75 steps later, it's done after nearly 6 months to maybe even a year to get it updated. We need policy management that's collaborative, that can address business change in a matter of weeks, not months. We need policies that are accessible, where people can access the policy, where there's a single policy portal for the organization, not 20 to 30 different policy portals, but a single policy portal that's easy to find the policies that are tagged to that specific role and job description. Policies that are engaging, that are easy to read and understand, and dynamic in the fact that they can keep up with the changing business environment. That gets back to the collaborative piece. Next slide, please. That brings us to the policy management capability model. That's out on policymanagementpro.com, where we have 5 components. The govern component defines the roles and standards for effective policy management. Roles being such as a policy governance committee, the policy manager role, policy author and approvers and owners, and standards like the policy on writing policies that lays out the life cycle, as well as the style guide for policies. Then it gets into the development, where you assess the need for a policy. Why do we need a policy? What's changed? And then the authoring of the policy, and how do we author and write, give the right tools to those authors and approve the policy. But once that policy is published, we then need to communicate it. How do we build that communication plan and delivery of communication and training and awareness on the policy? After that communication comes the enforcement, where we implement that policies, we monitor and we enforce the policy, and we document exceptions to the policy if exceptions are allowed. Some things like password policies have exceptions because there's some legacy systems that can't support the strong password policy. We might have an exception to a gift entertainment or hospitality policy for a very good reason, but we should never have an exception to a harassment policy or a discrimination policy. That would be very bad. That manager, you can harass people, but nobody else can. That you don't want exceptions there. But where you can have exceptions, you want to make sure that those exceptions are documented. And then you need to look at how do we improve policies. What's this cycle to maintain, revise those policies, and redesign them? Next slide, please. So it's been the Wild West, the Winchester Mystery House of policy management, where a lot of different departments have gone in different directions, and the organizations ended up with like 20 different policy portals. How do we address this? How do we bring consistency, harmony, collaboration to policy management? So on the next slide, that starts with a top-down process. It starts off with building your policy management strategic plan. What departments, roles, and functions issue policies? It's easy to sort of start with that to understand where are the policy portals and who owns them right now, and how are they going about doing that? And bringing those different groups together in a federated process across different departments and functions. Enterprise policy management, most often I'm seeing being led by the Chief Compliance and Ethics Officer, or the Chief Ethics and Compliance Officer. Sometimes I'm seeing it being led in human resources, but most often it's the Chief Ethics and Compliance Officer that I see leading enterprise policy management strategies. But how do we herd the cats of all these different departments issuing policies to build out a consistent policy management strategy, write a policy on writing policies, and implement the overall program from there? This often involves a strategic plan of establishing a policy management committee. And from there, we need the policy management process architecture, the life cycle policy management, from the authoring and the approval to the communication, to the enforcement, to the maintenance of the policy. And that's supported by a strong information and technology architecture. So that leads us to policy management maturity. Let's go through my 5 stages of the policy management maturity model, and you can decide where you are at in your organization. The first stage is the ad hoc maturity. This is the reactive firefighting. Organizations at the ad hoc stage of policy management have reactive approaches at the department level. Businesses at this stage do not actively manage policies. Few, if any, resources are allocated to policy management. The department addresses policy management in a reactive mode, writing policies when forced to. That external auditor said, you don't have this policy, you need one. They're writing a policy then. Characteristics of the ad hoc stage is siloed and ad hoc policy management practices, no structured and ongoing policy management program, no skills and resources dedicated to policy management, no defined policy management roles and responsibilities, no policy governance structure or matrix in place, no defined policy management program, policies that are written to put out fires, reactive approaches, firefighting, ad hoc and reactive policy management authoring and maintenance, document-centric approaches, reactive approaches that address policies as issues arise. We had an incident, no, where's our policy? We don't have one. Oh, we better write one. We write it and we forget about it. Little to no technology in place for policy management. Policy management is really done in documents, spreadsheets, emails, file shares, and SharePoint sites. No visibility, trending, or analytics of policies like metrics and benchmarking, and no board or senior management sponsorship. That's the ad hoc stage. Now let's look at the fragmented stage. The fragmented stage sees departments with some structure and focus on policy management within respective functions, but they are disconnected and not working together. Information and processes are highly redundant, manual, document-centric, and lack integration. With siloed approaches to policy management, the organization is still very document-centric. So what's the difference? The ad hoc stage is there's really no defined policy management program within a department, let alone the enterprise. And policies are really only written to put out fires and then they're forgotten. The fragmented stage, a department is trying to manage policies, but they're encumbered by manual processes with lots of documents, spreadsheets, and emails. And it takes 6 months to get that policy updated because somebody's got to write it, then it's emailed to the next person, then the next person, then the next person. It's very slow and encumbered by traditional documents, and spreadsheets and emails to manage this. Those are the characteristics where there's tactical siloed approaches. There's a life cycle in place, but with pockets of good practice emerging, but it's really relies on documents, spreadsheets, emails, manual processes to implement that life cycle. There's really limited to no policy monitoring and governance embedded within metrics and reporting. Processes are really defined at a department level, not cross departments. Some areas of policy management are in place, but not approached in an integrated, structured way, and so forth. But then let's move to the defined stage, in which the organization has a mature policy management program at a department level, but not across departments. The defined stage suggests that the organization has some areas of policy management that are managed well at a department level, but it lacks integration to address policy management across departments for an enterprise view of policies. Policy management processes have the beginning of an integrated information architecture supported by technology and ongoing reporting. Accountability and oversight for certain policy domains are beginning to emerge in the organization. So the characteristics here is that there's a defined and mature, structure for roles and responsibilities at a department level, but not across departments. There's a formalized policy management approach that is in place for the framework for an overall life cycle to monitor policies. There's most likely a policy on policies and style guide, that has some implementation at a department level, but it's not very well defined across departments. The organization is just starting to maybe mature there. And there's technology that's being deployed to mature policy management within the department. Then we move to the integrated stage. Now things get interesting. In the integrated stage, the organization has a cross-department strategy for managing policies across departments and functions. Policy management is aligned across several departments to provide consistent strategies, frameworks, templates, and processes supported by a common policy information technology architecture. The organization addresses policy management through shared processes and information that achieve greater efficiency and effectiveness, but not quite agility. That's going to be the next stage in another minute. So characteristics of the integrated stage is a strategic approach to policy management across departments. So we're starting to have an enterprise view. We have a policy governance model agreed at the board level where there's an established policy governance committee or steering committee and roles involved. There's a standardized policy management strategy that's been implemented. Policies are written, cataloged, mapped, and monitored according to agreed and understood criteria, like the policy on writing policies and style guides. There's robust policy monitoring measurements and metrics in place. Appropriate skill sets and resources with roles and responsibilities have been allocated. Key departments and executives are engaged and involved in policy management. Silos have begun to be eliminated. Common process, technology, information architecture across the organization to provide a singular approach to policies, and training and reporting is being done. That brings us to the final stage, the visionary stage, the agile stage. At the agile maturity stage, the organization has completely moved to an integrated approach to policy management across the business that includes collaborative policy authoring and leveraging artificial intelligence, or what we know as cognitive technologies, for regulatory change and policy mapping. There are consistent core policy management processes in place that span the entire organization and its geographies. The organization benefits from consistent, relevant, and harmonized processes for policy management with minimal overhead. Characteristics of this agile stage is that the organization has moved to a collaborative process for policy management. There's a consistent policy portal for the entire organization. All the policies are indexed and cataloged. An employee can access the policies based on their role and function by just logging in the portal, and they see what they need to see based on their role and function. And there's a collaborative process for policy authoring that multiple people can be working on the same policy at the same time without all this like linear, workflow that I got to work on it, then it moves to the next person, then it moves to the next person. It's a collaborative process. That's the agile stage. So let's move on to the next slide and see what can we do and where are we at today. First off, here are the 5 stages I just reviewed with you. Where are you at is the critical question. Now, the key thing to understand is that levels 1, 2, and 3, the ad hoc, fragmented, and defined, you might find multiple departments working together, multiple departments at different levels of maturity. Maybe HR is at a level 2. And IT security is at a level 3, and accounting is at a level 1. Different departments can be at levels 1, 2, and 3. But you can't get to levels 4 and 5 till you have a consistent approach to policy management across departments. And the key difference between levels 4 and 5 is the technology ability to keep up and make policies agile in a dynamic environment, which requires collaborative policy authoring engagement as well. So next, let's look at the critical elements to improve policy management maturity. And we'll start with policy governance and oversight. The first one here to take a look at is having a good structured governance model that is agreed at the board level and effectively communicated and supported across the organization. Where policies and procedures for policy management are fully documented, like the policy on writing policies, and consistently applied across the organization, and as well as the supporting style guides and templates. There's a defined policy management framework and life cycle that defines when a policy is written, who can write policies, what's the process to approve policies in the organization, and how policies are communicated, monitored, and maintained in the environment. That there's measurement and trending on policies at an enterprise view across departments. And policy management metrics are well defined and understood in the context of objectives, processes, and services of the organization. Next, we'll look at the critical elements to improve policy management maturity from people and engagement. That there are clear roles and responsibilities across the organization for policy management, such as the policy steering committee, the policy program manager, policy owners and authors. There's skills and resources that are being applied to policy management. There's a dedicated team in place and recognized as a center of excellence for policy management. There's skilled subject matter experts that are engaged in reviews of policies and changing risks and regulations to keep policies current with a changing business environment. And policy training and development is embedded, and resources is focused on strategic value-added components to the program. Then let's look at the process and execution to improve your policy management maturity in critical elements, where you need to look, do you have a well-defined and executed policy management lifecycle, processes across the organization? Is there a single version of truth for access to all the enterprise policies in a singular policy portal? How do you go about doing risk assessment and regulatory change management processes? And are they standardized and automated to ensure policies are current and relevant to address the organization's current risk profile and regulatory requirements? Is there segmentation and policies that are in place to map the organizational structure? Because you might have entity level policies like a code of conduct. You might have department level policies or process level policies like an accounts payable process or accounts receivable process or procurement process. You might have asset related policies like GDPR that focuses on EU citizen information and information assets of the organization. Can you map policies to the organizational structure and hierarchy of the entity, division, department, process, projects, or even assets? Do you have a clear view of policies across the enterprise in those levels? Are they mapped appropriately? Are you documenting policy issues and exceptions and exemptions in place and tracking those and remediation? Is there ongoing policy monitoring that is established with changes in risk profiles automatically triggering the appropriate actions and review of policies? And is there a clear view of policies for the extended enterprise of third-party relationships? Today's modern business isn't defined by brick and mortar walls and traditional employees. If you walk down the halls of an organization, if we're not in lockdowns, and half the people you come across are third parties, contractors, consultants, temporary workers, outsourcers, and service providers. And how do we apply policies across the extended enterprise? And how do we manage policies through business change, such as mergers and acquisitions, and program improvement? And finally, information and technology. To improve your policy management maturity, how can you leverage best-in-class policy management software that provides policy collaboration on authoring, where multiple people can work together on the same policy at the same time with full version control, editing, comments, and workflow? That I can be writing that conduct policy here in Milwaukee, Wisconsin, and in Singapore, in Australia, in the United Kingdom. Different people can be seeing the changes on the screen as I write them. They can be adding their sections to the same policy and making comments all real time together. That's modern software. This opening up a word processor, writing a document, emailing it to somebody else, that's an old way of doing things. There's better ways of delivering collaborative policy authoring and management in the organization. Another thing to look at is beyond policy collaboration, that singular portal for all employees to access policies wherever they're at and easily find the policies related to their role and function. And in enhancing all this, leveraging artificial intelligence to support automated policy management in context of regulatory and risk change that supports enhanced decision-making and agile policy alignment to a dynamic environment. So some 4 fundamental steps of establishing your policy management strategy. First, gain executive support and sponsorship of the policy management strategy and plan that you're building. Second, establish a dedicated cross-functional team focused on a common approach. Now, this should be led by somebody. And most often I see it being led by corporate compliance and ethics, but other times it's being led by human resources. But it involves multiple departments working together. Define that policy management framework and life cycle and harmonize your processes. But even before you get to step 1, I would say you also have to build your business case. What is your current state and how bad is it? And what are you trying to aim for in that future state to gain that support? And so a lot of times coming out of my workshop, people have to find, we have to do a policy inventory. We don't even know what policies we have. We have to do a policy discovery process and go out there and search file shares and hard drives and SharePoint sites and everything else and come back with everything that calls itself a policy or is tagged a policy. And we often find that we have a mess. There's out-of-date policies, conflicting policies, rogue policies, and that helps us build the business case to get on to these steps 1 to 4 here. But looking at technology in the next slide, we need to leverage technology that can help enable policy management in the organization, where we have a common repository for all the policies, we have a consistent policy management process, there's accountability through structured workflow and task management, and we're automating things with things like artificial intelligence. That's leveraged through a policy management technology that provides automation and tracking in the next slide, where there's good management reporting. I was talking to one firm that was spending 200 employee hours to build a report for the board of directors because they had to go through all these documents, spreadsheets, and emails, tabulate, aggregate information on the status of compliance and issues around policies and things like that to find out they had issues that started 11 months ago that have grown out of control. It took them 200 hours to build this report for the board. It now takes them less than 5 minutes. Well, there's a strong audit trail to track who did what, when, how, and why. Gets into defensible compliance, which we'll talk about in a couple slides from now. Workflow and tasks, so things don't get missed. There's good collaboration and enforcement. But on the next slide, it's also about that unified policy portal. From the desktop to the laptop to the tablet to the smartphone, that all those policies are available whenever, wherever they're at. through an intuitive, adaptive, personal, and accessible policy portal experience. It's intuitive, adaptive, and personal and accessible because it understands employees' roles. It might integrate with the HR system, and the new employee comes in and they're based on their role, they get shipped off the policies related to their job function and the tasks around it. One moves from one department to the next, it picks up on that and ships off the things, or they have to come back to the policy portal and complete their tasks. Then it might even have geopolitical information, geolocation information in it. Where I might land in a certain country and it might be known for bribery and corruption, and all of a sudden it says, we see you just landed in XYZ country. There's greater issues of US Foreign Corrupt Practices Act or UK Bribery Act violations here. You need to be aware of the political contribution policy, the facilitated payment policy, the gift and hospitality policy. I had a lunch in London, a coffee lunch, and somebody sat down with me, showed me that on their phone it popped up and say, oh, we see you have a business lunch with Michael Rasmussen. Here's a reminder of the gift entertainment policy on this and what you can expense. It's contextually aware, but we need a good engagement on policies through a unified policy portal from the desktop to the laptop to the tablet to the mobile device. But on the next slide, we need defensible policy management. What policy was communicated on what date and time? Were exceptions to that policy? Do we meet our regulatory requirements? When the regulators are knocking on our door, opposing counsel in a lawsuit, law enforcement, or the external auditors, they're not always asking, what's your policy today? But what was your policy 3 years ago when that privacy incident happened, where that harassment or discrimination happened? What was the policy? Who was it communicated to? How were they trained on the policy? We need a defensible system of record that can go back in time to show what policy was active on what date and time, all the interactions and activities about it. We're seeing this even from the regulatory standpoint in law enforcement. Look at the 2020 U.S. Department of Justice Evaluation and Compliance Programs guidance. One of the significant things that has evolved in the Department of Justice Evaluation and Compliance Programs is the need for defensible audit trails around policies. And you read that, and it actually mentions how many times people access the policy on a portal and having those records. You can go back to 2012 to the Morgan Stanley Foreign Corrupt Practices Act case. It's out there in a public memo on the Department of Justice website. This is 35 years into FCPA history. Morgan Stanley is the first company that had bribery and corruption happening. Mr. Peterson in the Asian real estate business was doing bad things, but they didn't prosecute the company. They only prosecuted Mr. Peterson. First time this has happened. And there's a memo on the Department of Justice website and the SEC website that you can go and refer to today that praises Morgan Stanley for what? Their policy management program. Morgan Stanley had policies to address bribery and corruption. Morgan Stanley can demonstrate how these policies are maintained as risk change, business change, regulations change. Morgan Stanley can demonstrate how many times Mr. Peterson and other groups of employees were access policies, reminded of policies, trained on policies. A defensible record. My friends, documents, spreadsheets, and emails, poorly configured SharePoint sites do not get you there. You need a good, solid information technology architecture to build on defensible compliance. And then on the next slide, we need to be able to provide metrics and measurement related to policy engagement. What types of questions are coming in? Ambiguity and clarity questions. If we're getting some questions into the compliance help desk or the HR help desk, that's good. That means people are aware there's a policy. But if we're getting a lot of questions, particularly the same question, it means this policy needs to be adjusted here. Maybe we need to add some clarity because it's a little bit of ambiguous or doesn't cover a new situation. Have all the policies been approved? Do the policies meet our current risks and regulations and legislation and business change? What are the issues and incidents and cases and investigations we've had on the policy? What do they point to? Are we hiring bad, wicked, evil people that want to violate policies? Or is it actually showing that, we actually have a management problem here? Management's saying that policy doesn't apply when it actually does. Or maybe it's a training awareness problem. What type of exceptions are we granting? Again, you don't want exceptions to a harassment policy or discrimination policy. That would be bad, very bad. But some policies we do give exceptions to. Are they being documented? But what's the status of too many exceptions? Because at some point, you grant too many exceptions to a policy. It's no longer a policy, it's a guideline, it's permissive. What's the issues of non-compliance? What about delivery, training, attestation, communication? Have everybody gone through code of conduct training and privacy training and attest to the privacy policy or the code of conduct in the last year? What are those metrics? And then on the next slide, what's the role of technology? What do you look for in good policy management technology? First, I'd say collaboration on policies. The old way is opening up a word processor, writing a document, shipping it off to the next person. They're making their edits and comments, shipping it back, then making the edits, comments, and shipping it back to them, then shipping it back, then finally it moves on to the next person. 75 steps later, you have an approved policy. That's the old way of doing it. The modern way is this collaborative policy authoring environment where multiple people can be working on the policy at the same time and be able to engage on that, and taking policy updates or new policies from 6 months down to like a matter of a week or two, at most a month. And being able to enable contextually relevant decision-making on policies because it's mapped to risks and objectives. The ability to engage employees through a singular portal, providing analytics and dashboards on metrics on the policy, and 360-degree contextual awareness of how that policy applies in business change and circumstances. Understand and connect to regulations through the leveraging of cognitive technologies like natural language processing and things to be able to map policies to regulations. Provide that defensible system of record to provide to the regulators, external auditors, law enforcement, opposing counsel, and lawsuit to show you how that policy is monitored and enforced. Leverage templates, capture exceptions and exemptions to policies, monitor the changing internal external environment to make sure policies are relevant to that dynamic environment, and provide structured workflow, tasks, and notifications on policies. All this means that we're aiming for what we call agile policy management. In agile policy management, on the next slide, it's about being aware of our business and the policies across the business and keeping policies current in that environment. This allows us to align and work together across corporate compliance and ethics and human resources and accounting and IT and environmental and health and safety and quality and other departments that are managing policies. To work together, to be more responsive to a changing regulatory, business, and risk environment, to make sure our policies address the current environment. And to be agile, where it doesn't take us months and months to get those updates to policies, but it can be there in a matter of days to weeks, which enables us to be more resilient in our organizations and more efficient in our use of human and financial capital. If you've liked this webinar today, two things to be aware of. There is a research document that's available on the ClauseMatch website on my policy management maturity model, and that's available to you. We're also doing the Policy Management by Design workshop in New York on November 15th, just a few weeks from now. Encourage you to do that. I have people that fly in from all over to go to these workshops, even internationally at times. And they're quite a great way, not just to hear my content on policies, but to collaborate and learn from your peers on policies. Because it is a workshop, that means there's time to share, interact, and engage, not just listen. And so I'd like to encourage you to do that. So let's turn it over to Q&A time now.
Thank you. So it looks like we have time to address 2 questions. So if you guys have any questions, feel free to put them in the Q&A box at this time. The first question is from John. It's around how often should policies be updated? So for example, should policies be updated when there's a new final rule in the Federal Register with a future effective date?
There's multiple ways to answer that question. First off, there should be a regular maintenance schedule. So outside other triggers, there should be some type of regular maintenance schedule. That best practice is every policy is reviewed annually, every year, to make sure it's still current for the environment. Some organizations, that's a lot to manage, and I've seen them tier it. Like high risk policies with a lot of legal exposure are reviewed every year. Moderate risk policies every 2 years, and low risk policies every 3 years. But there should be some regular review cycle that's on a cyclical time schedule for every policy. But then there should be triggers, such as a regulatory change that was just referenced, that should trigger a review of a policy outside that cycle, or an enforcement action. Maybe our significant competitor just got hit with a major fine, and we want to make sure we're covered and we're addressing things that were outlined in that enforcement action in our policies before the regulator comes or law enforcement comes looking at our door. Or significant changes in the risk environment, or things like business changes like mergers and acquisitions. So there should be a regularly cyclical scheduled review of policies. Best practices every policy annually, although that can be tiered. And there should be some type of triggers and metrics as well for review of policies.
Perfect. Let's see if we have any more questions. Okay, the other question is around the workshop. So Will it be virtual? Unfortunately, the way these workshops run, they're really more collaborative and, in the environments that we're in. So unfortunately, they are only in person only. So the New York one, as Michael mentioned, is on November 15th. We are looking to plan future runs later this year into early next year. So we'll send out more information with that. So with that, I'd like to thank you, Michael, for presenting today. And thank you everyone for showing up. Just as a reminder, I will send out an email with a link to the recording, as well as a link to the report that Michael mentioned. So if you're interested in downloading that, there will be a link for it in the email. With that, I want to thank you again, Michael, and wish everyone a great day. Thank you, everyone.